If we want to live a life not controlled by our anxiety, we need to stop looking for relief from our anxious symptoms and instead start the process of figuring out just how much we can bear. Humans have consistently overcome insurmountable challenges, but the reality is there is only one way we can truly overcome our challenges, and that is by adapting to them.
The educational content of this video is intended for solution-focused coaching purposes only. The information and e-learning courses provided by the Anxiety Treatment Center of West Michigan Online are not designed as a substitute for mental health treatment by a licensed mental health provider, or a substitute for medical treatment by a licensed physician.
To understand why we struggle with anxiety so much, we really do need to go back to the beginning. An early death was likely for prehistoric humans. The average age range was between 15 to 35 years. So here's what our brains decided to do so that we can live longer. The brain decided that anything that was uncertain was bad. Why? Our brains concluded that not knowing what can happen, meaning uncertainty, was really likely to get you killed. I mean, should we walk up to this elephant and pet it? Should we run away from it? I mean, there's just so much uncertainty going on about this situation. You see, nature is like a huge game of chance. You just never know what you're going to get. I mean, what is behind these doors? Is it $1 million or a room full of poisonous snakes? So not only does the brain think that uncertainty is bad, it thinks that uncertainty equals death. But it doesn't just end there. The brain takes it a step further. The brain thinks that all uncertainty equals death. It is just way too complicated to figure out what uncertainty is safe and what uncertainty is deadly. Now that the brain has this ingenious yet simple strategy to keep you alive longer by labeling all uncertainty as death, it needs a really awesome way to get your attention when the brain is detecting uncertainty. Imagine that when your brain detected uncertainty, you simply just got an itch in your ear. Well, I don't know about you, but an itch in the ear is not going to get my attention. Your brain thinks that uncertainty is deadly, and if all you get is an itch in your ear, that's not going to make you take precaution. So, how does your brain get your attention when it detects uncertainty? Well, it gives your body this full rush of energy from adrenaline. You know, all the stuff we learned in the past about fight or flight. It fills your body with this adrenaline so that you can be aware and alert that your brain has detected uncertainty. The amount of adrenaline, which we can now start calling anxiety, well, it really depends on how much uncertainty your brain is detecting around you. Important yet simple things to remember. All uncertainty equals death to the brain. Uncertainty equals anxiety. Anxiety equals discomfort. And discomfort equals awareness of uncertainty. The physical feelings of anxiety didn't really bother our ancestors, no matter how high their anxiety was. Why? Well, they were actually more concerned with the possibility of dying and the pain of dying, rather than being concerned about the possibility of feeling anxiety and the discomfort they would get from that feeling. Because death was all around, anxiety was like this helpful signal for early humans to be cautious whenever they experienced uncertainty. Remember, uncertainty equaled death according to our brains. So in a cool way, anxiety was like this death prevention superpower. So it's really hard to hate anxiety when it's keeping you alive, especially if things are dying around you all the time. Early humans didn't dislike feeling anxiety. They appreciated it greatly. And more importantly, they accepted it and they adapted to the feelings of anxiety. When we are feeling hungry, hot, or cold, we don't think of these as high distress moments, typically. They are simply just cues to potentially alter or change our behavior. Well, anxiety operated the same way for early humans. It was a cue to potentially alter or change their behavior or they could die. Important yet simple things to remember for how our ancestors responded to anxiety. Early humans, they appreciated anxiety. It helped them to live longer. Early humans were adapted to anxiety due to their appreciation of it. And anxiety caused less emotional distress for early humans because they were adapted to it. On your left, you've got your typical night scene for early humans. Not a lot going on there. And on your right, you've got your typical night scene for modern day humans who live in a metropolitan area. I don't know about you, but I picked the city. I mean, I do not know what's going on in those woods. I don't know what's in there. I'm just thinking something's behind one of those trees and it wants to jump out and eat me. In our modern day society, there is just much less anxiety about surviving throughout the day. Some days we actually even forget that we can die. But not early humans. They were reminded daily that they could die. They were either killing things or things were killing them. So, because we live longer and we have less uncertainty about surviving throughout the day, our brains, they've now changed their mind about how they think about uncertainty. They no longer think that uncertainty equals death. So our brains have changed and they've calmed down. Actually, I'm just kidding. See, it doesn't matter that we live longer and that we're safer compared to early humans. The brain still thinks that all uncertainty equals death. The reason we live longer is because this exact rule exists. Early humans, well, they had relatively simple lives. The things that they could be uncertain about were mostly related to survival. This is not the case for modern day humans. Our lives are complicated. Most of our uncertainty is not related to life or death. Well, the brain doesn't care about our complicated uncertainty that's not related to death. All uncertainty still equals death to the brain. Therefore, any uncertainty, whether dangerous or not, will give you some level of anxiety. The brain just wants it to be this way. We may be all fancy, advanced, and civilized compared to early humans, but we still have the same primitive brain. So, what does this mean? It means that parts of your day that have nothing to do with life or death will cause you some level of anxiety if there is uncertainty present in that part of your day. Our anxiety is an automated process, just like getting hungry is, and there's nothing we can do about it. Imagine when you got hungry if you responded negatively to this uncontrollable response. You would actually begin to psychologically condition yourself to become distressed every time you got hungry. Well, the same is true for anxiety. If you respond negatively to the uncontrollable automated process of anxiety, well, you begin to psychologically condition yourself to become distressed about being anxious. Important yet simple things to remember for anxiety in the modern day world. Non-life threatening modern day uncertainty still equals death to the brain. Anxiety will be felt during uncertain parts of your day. Uncertainty is causing your anxiety, not you. Your anxiety is automated. There are four main reasons why anxiety is becoming a leading problem globally. These reasons are cultural norms, cultural stigma, instant gratification culture, and anxiety intolerance. We're going to break these four reasons up into two parts, and we'll first look at part one of two of the four reasons why. The first two reasons why anxiety is becoming a leading problem globally are cultural norms and cultural stigma. We'll first take a look at Western cultural norms. In our culture, we value looking beautiful. We value looking strong and fit. We value looking powerful and successful. we value looking strong and confident. And definitely, we value looking wealthy and well off. But we don't value looking like this. Or this, or this, or this. You see, we hate looking anxious. Why? Well, it's because of something called social stigma theory. In 1960, social psychologist Irving Goffman developed at the time a groundbreaking theory called the theory of social stigma. Goffman loved to study humans interacting with each other to better understand why we behave the way that we do. Goffman's theory of social stigma states that social stigma is something about a person that is not exactly what the majority of society values. That something about the person causes them to be classified by the majority of society in an undesirable and rejected stereotype. Just what does an undesirable, rejected stereotype mean? It means being mocked and socially excluded. According to Goffman, if you have a rejected stereotype placed on you, then you run the risk of being mocked and socially rejected. If you are mocked and socially rejected or excluded, according to Goffman, well, you are less likely to be able to fully participate in society. If you frequently look anxious in Western culture, well, you're likely to have an undesirable, rejected stereotype placed on you. It is then possible that you could be mocked and socially excluded. And finally, it's possible that you may be limited in your ability to fully participate in all aspects of society because looking anxious is just not desirable in our culture. So, wait a minute. If you can't fully participate in society because you look anxious too frequently, that sounds like a lower quality of life. Well, that's right. And that is also called discrimination. And more specifically, it's called anxiety discrimination. Yes, that is a real thing in our culture. I like this simple description of discrimination. It reads that discrimination is the treatment of a person or a particular group of people differently in a way that is worse than the way people are usually treated. In our society, people who look anxious are discriminated against, also known as treated differently. Looking continuously anxious is dangerous and is bad for your quality of life. In our society, we just simply won't let you progress too far. Don't believe me? I want you to imagine trying to start your professional career and make a good living for yourself. Now, imagine that you consistently look anxious while you're trying to progress in this career. Just how far do you think you would get? Over the past 6 years, as a mental health therapist and a top anxiety specialist, which I am honored to hold that distinction, I truly love the work that I do with my clients. I've treated severe anxiety issues in professionals from a variety of industries. I've treated doctors, I've treated dentists, lawyers, psychologists, psychiatrists, pharmacists, police officers, police detectives, scientists, college professors, K through 12 teachers, and corporate executives. These individuals, they all had their individual severe anxiety issues, but they all had one thing in common. The one thing that these professionals all had in common, besides anxiety, was that looking anxious or severely anxious too often was going to ruin their careers. In our culture, unfortunately, looking anxious just means you are not the thing that we value. Because looking anxious is not the thing that we value in our culture, we are conditioned to hide our anxiety so that we don't run the risk of looking anxious. The things available today in our society to get rid of anxiety, they are no different than body enhancement products that get rid of things that are undesirable to society. However, something starts to happen when we try and hide our anxiety and keep our anxious symptoms down. It starts to make us uncertain about how well we'll be able to hide our anxiety, and it makes us uncertain about how well we'll be able to control it. Do you remember what we learned earlier about uncertainty? Yes, you are biologically designed to get anxious whenever you experience any type of uncertainty. So, cultural stigma makes you self conscious about looking anxious. And as a result, you get uncertain about your ability to hide your anxiety or keep the symptoms down. Well, your brain picks up on your uncertainty. And guess what? It gives you more anxiety. Wow, what an unfortunate and horrible cycle of distress. But some might say, wait, don't you mean a horrible cycle of feeling anxious and experiencing those uncomfortable feelings? Well, I would say no. I mean, it's a horrible cycle of feeling distress, not feeling anxiety symptoms. Feeling anxiety is not a problem. Anxiety was never meant to bother us or cause us problems. Just like other things that could be discomforts that we tolerate, we're supposed to be adapted to the feelings of anxiety, just like early humans were. Feeling anxiety isn't horrible, but it does start to become horrible when everything in your society and environment is encouraging you not to show it, and you keep experiencing it because you can't control it. This is called psychological distress, and more specifically, it's called anxiety distress. And that's the real problem here, and the real thing people are struggling with. They are struggling with distress about consistently experiencing something that is outside of their control that society disapproves of. But here is the real crazy thing. All of us are trying to hide or reduce our anxiety, thinking that others have less than we do. This is called perceived anxiety stigma. Perceived anxiety stigma simply means that we perceive that others are less anxious than we are. We also perceive that every single person thinks negatively about other people with anxiety. So what do? We end up shaming ourselves for not being like other people and having less anxiety. Remember, this is our perception, that others have less than we do. But some may say, what about chemical imbalances and genetics? Aren't some people just genetically prone to have way too much anxiety? I would say that's true, actually. Some people are just more predisposed to have more anxiety than other people. However, it doesn't mean that you have a genetic disadvantage. It is actually a genetic advantage. It just simply means that you are more sensitive to uncertainty, and without the added social stigma of society, you would simply just be more cautious than other people. But because of the effects of social stigma, you are now most likely dealing with a raging anxiety issue. Part two of the 4 reasons why anxiety is becoming a leading problem globally. In part two, we will look at instant gratification culture and anxiety intolerance. First, let's take a look at instant gratification culture. We like to feel good. We want to feel good. And actually, we kind of need to feel good in our society. Otherwise, we start thinking that life isn't going well. How did it get this way? One explanation is the effect of business on our culture. Companies, they spend a lot of money on research and development to create products that make our lives easier. Business practices can shape culture. The business practice of making products that continuously make our lives easier, well, it begins to psychologically condition and encourage us to search for readily available things to get rid of discomforts. And it encourages us less to tolerate those discomforts. This isn't a bad thing. Actually, it's great. But for certain things, it's not so great. If we seek to avoid discomforts too much, then certain things that were never intended to be distressing, well, they now start to become distressing, like anxiety and feeling anxious. Now, I don't intend to give you a pull yourself up by your bootstrap speech. However, earlier generations, they were more adapted to anxiety, meaning that it caused them less distress, just simply due to the fact that there were less things available to temporarily block or relieve their anxiety symptoms. Therefore, in most situations, they were actually forced to deal with their anxiety, and most actually learned to accept and tolerate it. Think of adaptation as a strong tolerance for something. And I want you to think of tolerance as a muscle. If you're someone who doesn't lift weights at all, then your muscles have probably very little tolerance to lifting heavy weights. And if you were forced to lift heavy weights, this would cause a lot of distress for you. And it would just simply mean that you are not well adapted for heavy weightlifting. However, this problem is easily fixable. The more you expose yourself to heavier weights, the more your muscles will begin to tolerate the heavier weight load, causing you much less distress about that type of weight being on you. In this example, you are beginning to adapt to heavier weightlifting. Because of cultural anxiety stigma and instant gratification culture, these things, they encourage us to think very negatively about anxiety. And because of that, we never actually entertain the possibility of tolerating our anxiety because we simply label it as a problem. Our cultural avoidance of looking anxious and our unwillingness to tolerate and accept anxiety over time begins to create an intolerance to anxiety. This is called a maladaptation, simply meaning we are not adapted. Maladaptation can be defined as a failure to adjust adequately or appropriately to the environment or situation. What have we failed to adjust to adequately? We have failed to adequately adjust to our body's desire to make us anxious in the presence of any and all uncertainty. Our ancestors, they accepted this as a fact of life, and they were naturally adapted to it. Today, we are struggling to adapt to a feeling that was never intended to cause us this much distress. Important yet simple things to remember about why anxiety is becoming a leading problem globally. Cultural anxiety stigma creates uncertainty about looking and feeling anxious. Uncertainty about looking and feeling anxious, that creates more anxiety. Instant gratification culture creates an intolerance to feeling anxious. Intolerance to anxiety creates anxiety distress. We need to adapt to our anxiety. Let's quickly define adaptation. Adaptation is to change your behavior so that it is easier to live in a particular place or situation. The process of adaptation is nature's natural solutions to life's problems. Adaptation is just simply in our DNA. Our society and culture is not trying to purposely make us unadapted to anxiety. We can view our maladaptation to anxiety as an unintended side effect of our culture's desire for progress. And particularly, we want to progress by looking bigger, faster, stronger, smarter, and more well off. Even helping professions cannot escape the effects of cultural influences. Therefore, most helping professionals and professions will try to address your anxiety issue by trying to help you to get rid of your anxiety and your anxiety symptoms. As we have learned in this presentation about anxiety, when it comes to anxiety, what we can't do is we can't fight it. We can't overcome it. We cannot get rid of it. We can't kick its butt. And we can't stop it. All of these solutions for anxiety are culturally influenced due to our culture's desire not to look anxious. And in addition, when we think about anxiety, it's not bad. It's not horrible. It's not a devil. It's not a monster. And it's not a disease. It is simply our body's desire to protect us from uncertainty. Anxiety is almost solely responsible for allowing us to go from the Stone Age to present day. Instead of allowing cultural norms and cultural anxiety stigma to influence us to negatively label anxiety, what we should do is we should appreciate, tolerate, and start to accept our anxiety. And in addition, we should start to begin to adapt to the feelings that it gives us, rather than wanting these feelings to go away. What happens when we are adapted to our anxiety? Well, definitely not this. From this picture, it would appear that the anxiety is causing all sorts of problems for this person. However, in reality, what is really causing a problem for this person is the psychological distress they are experiencing about having anxiety that society tells them that they should not feel and that they also should be able to control. When we are not adapted to anxiety, we experience a significant amount of psychological distress. Therefore, as we have covered earlier in this presentation, anxiety is not the problem. Culturally influenced psychological distress about being anxious, well, that's the problem. This is what happens when your body is adapted to anxiety. As your body continues to make you anxious during any type of uncertainty, your distress about being anxious begins to go way down. Meaning, although you are feeling anxiety, you are experiencing much less psychological distress about being anxious, which in turn is a much better quality of life. How do we become adapted to anxiety? Adaptation to anxiety happens when changes are made to our behavior and to our thinking patterns. We cannot adapt to anxiety with the same thought patterns and behaviors. To adapt to our anxiety, we must radically disconnect from the negative socially ingrained thoughts that we have about anxiety. That means if people are talking negatively about anxiety, we simply either need to get away from that conversation or we can join the conversation and highlight the positives about anxiety as well. We also need to stop trying to avoid, hide, and suppress our anxiety. We need to stop trying to calm down, and we need to focus on tolerating our anxiety. Once we can tolerate it, then we can start outright accepting our anxiety and begin to experience much less psychological distress about being anxious. By incorporating these strategies of radically changing your thoughts about anxiety and your behaviors, over time, you will begin to develop a very healthy relationship with your anxiety, and you'll actually begin to free yourself from this culturally influenced cycle of anxiety distress. So, if you are ready to start an amazing journey on anxiety adaptation and freeing yourself from the culturally influenced cycle of distress, this innovative course will systematically guide you through the natural process of anxiety adaptation on your journey to less anxiety distress. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching this presentation, and I really look forward to working with you. Important yet simple things to remember about adaptation, nature's natural solution. Cultural anxiety stigma has unintentionally caused psychological distress about looking anxious. Psychological distress can lead to an anxiety intolerance. Anxiety adaptation reverses the effects of cultural anxiety stigma and anxiety intolerances. Anxiety adaptation begins with radical changes in our thoughts and behaviors related to anxiety. So now let's bring this all together with some important yet simple things to remember about this anxiety presentation. Any and all uncertainty will cause anxiety for everyone. Anxiety has become intolerable due to cultural norms and cultural anxiety stigma. Anxiety adaptation reverses the effects of cultural anxiety stigma and anxiety intolerances. Anxiety adaptation begins with radical changes in our thoughts and in our behaviors related to anxiety. Here are your instructions for the next several days. Take 2 or 3 days to observe how you respond to your anxiety. I want you to notice your thoughts about anxiety in yourself and in others. Are these thoughts negative, neutral, or positive? Notice your behaviors towards anxiety. Do you try and reduce your anxiety or avoid feeling it altogether? Also, notice the conversations around you about anxiety. Are they even happening at all? And are they positive, neutral, or negative?
Thank you for watching this presentation.